Happened. This is Don. Not actually sitting in the host chair today. I'm going to call the chair that I'm sitting in today the introducer's chair because, as you're quickly going to discover as we go through the remainder of this episode, I was not part of the panel. I was not leading that discussion nor even participating in that discussion. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our episode today because it reflects one of the goals and objectives that we had with starting the room where it happened, which was taking advantage of our cast of contributors who are knowledgeable, that we would have a community experience in terms of producing that podcast. So I'm very pleased that Chris Capola took the lead today on this particular episode, and he was joined by Eric Rush. You should know both of them from past episodes of this podcast, as well as our companion podcast, sort of the mother podcast, A Fork in Time. Today's episode comes a little out of sequence from what we previously planned due to some of the changes that we've had in our production schedule and just the conflicts that have come up in terms of getting things done. Originally, you're going to hear this alluded to at the end of the podcast. We were planning to do something that related more to a November event with the episode that's being released here in November, room number 4. But we accelerated that, and you'll have that episode come along next month, and I think it will still be equally relevant and equally important. But today we're going to, in room number 4, the room is going to be the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, and I'm very happy to introduce what you're about to hear next, which is the discussion about that room and around that as a topic from our own Chris Capola and our own Eric Rush. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of The Room Where It Happened. This is Chris Capola, and I am joined today by Eric Rush. You want to introduce yourself for a sec?
Yeah, hi Chris. Thanks. Glad to join you today to talk about our topic.
So today's topic is when I was first approached with the idea for a room where it happened, this was the first thing that came to my mind. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I'm going to make a confession to you, everyone out there in podcast world. I've never actually seen Hamilton, so it wasn't even. I wasn't even tied into the original concept. And okay, yeah, that's where it came from. That's the original one. But I'm going to go ahead and make an argument that the room we're going to talk about today, and when you get done listening to this, you might even agree, hopefully, this is really the room where stuff happens. So the room that we're going to talk about today is the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, France. You want to jump in for a sec here?
Yeah, so I have seen Hamilton, and I love Hamilton, and sometimes I sing Hamilton songs in the car. But I will agree with you that this really is the room where it happened, and I've been fortunate enough to actually get to see the Hall of Mirrors, and so my wife and I were in Versailles in 2019, and so it was very exciting to actually see it. And you could feel all of the history, so much history that's there, which I thought was really cool.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to get a chance to get over there. I haven't myself, but this is a really big one. So the Hall of Mirrors, can you kind of, I guess the first thing we should do is get, and this is really lucky, get a firsthand account of the hall. What is it? Like what does this room look like? I guess is one.
Yeah, so the Hall of Mirrors is really striking because it's very long, and it feels simultaneously extremely large and to me, but still a little claustrophobic. And I can't necessarily put that to any more description than that, other than that's kind of how I felt when you were there. And there's statues lining on either side of it. It's really just this incredible place, and you have this very ornate ceiling above you. It's a really incredible and almost kind of grandiose, over the top appearance to this Hall of Mirrors.
Okay. So the reason we keep talking around this is this room, it you can almost feel like almost 150 years of European history is wrapped up in one room. So there's three kind of distinct things I want to talk about, the big events that happen in it. The first is it is part of Versailles. It is part of Louis XIV magnum opus. This is his big house. This is his. We're going to go ahead and build this magnificent palace and bring all of the French nobles together. Everyone will come here and wait on me personally, hand and foot. It's very tied up in that whole Sun King idea.
I am the state.
Yes. Yes. Let's fast forward a little bit to 1870 and the Franco-Prussian War. At this point, France has lost this war. This is, if you remember over on the other podcast, A Fork in Time, there's an episode I did called The Lime Lobby about Cinco de Mayo, which is around the same time. And one of the things I talked about is the modern American sense of the French army is that it's a punchline.
Right.
It was not a punchline when Versailles was built.
No, it was not. And I don't know, Chris, if you ever read The Onion.
Yes.
And so a lot of times when there's any talk about a war in The Onion, there's always a subtext that says the French surrender. And so you're exactly right that there is this idea that the French army is this, this paper tiger. It's not a competent army. And, historically speaking, that is simply not true.
The joke that I told during the Cinco de Mayo episode was it celebrates the victory of the Mexican army against the French army, or as it's called in German, Tuesday. Well, this was the first Tuesday, 1870. This was really the first time that France had been beaten by anybody other than like the rest of Europe having to get together and gang up on them.
Right.
This is the first.
Well, one of the things that's always struck me about the Franco-Prussian War is that it really was the Franco-Prussian War. This was not the German Empire as we understand this. This was the North German Confederation led by Prussia. But I also think that inherently this massive victory really paved the way for the integration of Southern Germany to really create that German Empire. I don't know, and maybe you have some different thoughts about this, Chris. I don't know whether it would have happened the exact same way had there not been this huge victory in the Franco-Prussian War.
I don't think it would have. And that's the really cool thing about this room is where they pick to make that union.
Right.
You have Prussia, led by their Kaiser Wilhelm, who's kind of put together the North German Confederation,
right.
But that is also still a confederation of independent states that they're aligning together, but they're all still very independent. And you have the Southern German states, which my favorite guy, Bismarck, I kind of wish Alexis were here so we could have the argument over whether like Europe after 1850 is the Bismarckian era or the Victorian era. I have some pretty strong feelings. Had been able to cobble this North German thing together, right, and at least separate Bavaria and Southern Germany from Austria, which was the other great power playing for Germany, because both Prussia and Austria kind of say, we are the German. We want to say we're the main German power. He succeeded in kind of separating the South in 1866 in the war against Austria. But what happens in 1871 is they finally get the Southern Germans going in the same direction as the North Germans, have this shocking, massive victory over the French. And just to rub it in their face, just to kind of just give them that last little about everything, Kaiser Wilhelm is proclaimed the Emperor of Germany. You said you're right. When it started, the German Empire didn't exist. When everyone walks out of this room, it does exist.
There is a German Empire. Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
they decide to have all of these princes from these other German states proclaim him the emperor in this exact room, which up until then is the symbol of the Sun King and French dominance of all of Europe.
Well, and this
So
is, and there
yeah.
was a whole, and this is a whole, constitution and a whole governmental structure, a true creation of the state of the German Empire that didn't exist before. I mean, I think
Right.
that and this happened so quickly is really incredible. And even though it did happen, it strikes me that this was historically improbable. But it happened. It happened, and it totally upset the peace that was created post Napoleon.
Yeah.
And so now you have this huge amount of power asymmetry with this incredibly powerful German Empire that exists right in the middle of Europe, surrounded by hostile powers.
Not surrounded by hostile powers.
Well, except if you had France, and then you had Russia, which is kind of a wild card.
Russia was a wild card. By the way, I just have this picture, and anybody who's worked for somebody with an ego will feel for me right now. Because the reason I really stress that Germany was not surrounded by hostile powers is this. I'm going to take a step back to the first episode I ever did, Wilhelm II, No Cigar.
Okay.
That guy messed some stuff up.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
But what Bismarck was able to do was come in and in a low-key, smart, diplomatic way was play all of these powers off against each other so that when he wants to fight Austria, like we talked about, where he wants to kind of separate the South German states from Austria, he plays with France and Italy because they want to take on Austria. And he makes a deal with Russia to stay out of this so that he's constantly playing it so that he's only ever really fighting the power he wants to fight.
No, that's fair. And I think, and that's a good context for kind of the early stages of either the North German Confederation or the German Empire. And we were thinking about this from, again, Alexis isn't here. We're going to call this the Bismarckian era, but 1870s, 1880s, you're exactly right that he is able to do this. Later on, when he's not able to be that factor, there is when you see Germany aligning with Austria-Hungary and surrounded on either side by powers that are not friendly, and we saw where that ends up, which is the next part of the Hall of Mirrors, and probably an era that I think is very interesting to both of us, and I know an era that you have a lot of expertise in, Chris. And this is the World War I and post World War I era.
Right. But before we jump to that, there was just one other thought I just had was, Bismarck has been so intelligent playing the ego of these rulers off against each other. And I can just imagine him at the moment of triumph where we finally, he wanted to create a German state.
Right.
And like you said, in the 1870s and 80s, he does masterfully maneuver things so that Germany isn't surrounded by these enemies because he sees that it could be. And then, everybody's in agreement. He's talked to all of these princes. We're going to go ahead and proclaim my king the German emperor. And where are we going to do it? But in a place that is guaranteed to make France a permanent enemy of me forever. And I just picture, and I feel like I want to do, for those of you out there familiar with memes, I kind of want to do like a Photoshop of Bismarck doing the Picard face palm, because that's what I feel like happens at this moment.
It really is. It's
when he's done all of this brilliant work, and somebody comes along with a fur somewhere, and he's like, "We're gonna do this in their home.
We're gonna do
place.
this."
And he's like, "Oh boy,
we couldn't have done this in Berlin."
Yeah." So you're absolutely right. Yeah, he got overruled. He did create like permanent hatred with the French, which was through that period of the Bismarckian era, that's the only country that is going to take sides against Germany.
Right.
Everybody else, he's playing different games with everyone, but always keeping his options open. And you're absolutely right. He was mortal. He was going to die, and that's definitely an argument. Could anybody have maintained that? Okay, the person that took over after him couldn't. I
Right.
think we can agree that.
Yes. Absolutely can agree.
And so the next person to take over is Wilhelm II of Germany, Kaiser Bill, who, yeah, some of you may know from propaganda posters,
Right.
because this is the guy that basically causes World War. If I want to say one guy who caused World War One, this is the guy. Other than Gavrilo Princip, whatever, this is the guy. He just kind of bulling the China shop, screws up the Bismarckian order, winds up, puts himself in a situation where you're absolutely right. Germany is surrounded by enemies because he doesn't see that as a problem. He sees Germany as weirdly, almost like a lot of times when you read about history, you hear about people picking up the mantle of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Byzantium was the second Rome. And then this was a concept in Russia. Now we are the third Rome. There's this almost this concept of Germany being the second European hegemon. And we picked that up in Versailles. Okay. Still a stupid idea. Anyway, World War One happens, and now the French are sitting there, and they have the opportunity to get to the Germans again. So where do they have the great peace treaty that is going to, you mentioned that the creation of Germany unsettled the Treaty of Vienna, post-Napoleonic settlement. Where are we going to have the treaty signed that's going to recreate European stability? Where are we going to have that signed?
We're going to go right back to Versailles.
We are going to have it in the room where Germany was born.
The room where it happened. Yep.
And have them accept responsibility for destroying Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's a nice second little corollary to this. It's not quite the same room, but it's still a really interesting idea of this geographic back and forth where so the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the Hall of Mirrors, which was the official agreement that ended the First World War. The rail car where the German representatives asked for the armistice, asked to stop the war. Basically, they asked, let's stop the fighting, and we're going to figure out what's going to happen afterwards. We can have this negotiation. Versailles was not a negotiation, but okay, whatever.
Right.
Where they asked for that armistice, the French take that rail car and they put it in a museum, because this is another of these really geographic, historical things that's important. I see Eric nodding because he probably knows what happened to this rail car in a couple of years. Spoiler alert. You remember how I was talking about how Versailles is going to settle Europe for the next 100 years after Vienna? It didn't.
It didn't. It settled it for a very, very short amount of time that nobody was really happy with.
Yeah. And so when the next time Germany settled France's hash in June of 1940, guess what?
Right.
Hitler sent the people to go. He's like, you know what? No, find me that rail car.
Go get the rail car.
I want to know where that is. And we're going to sign the French surrender in that rail car. And then this is the one thing, he did that might make a little bit of sense. He made sure that they blew up that rail car
Yeah.
just in case it swung back against him. He
Just in
did
case it
not want
swung
this
back
coming to
against him,
bite him.
he didn't want to have to sign another peace treaty or another surrender back in the same rail car again. No, this is done. This is done.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just thinking about this, and I want to go back and talk a little bit more about the first period of this room. It just strikes me as a little odd that the EU hasn't used this room for anything. Given the importance and the power of France and Germany within the EU itself, and also their cooperation in founding the Coal and Steel Pact,
Right.
which was the basis for the EU. It seems like this is kind of a geographic location, kind of a sense that I can't imagine why they wouldn't want to go back there and have something to bury the hatchet, and we both have this history there.
Do you think, though, Chris, maybe the history is still, even though it's been over the past 100 years, and Germany and France are now allies and all that, but I still think some of those the old feelings do die hard.
Mhm.
And so I do wonder if it might be still seen as a somewhat aggressive move on the French side. So that's one thought, which is, of course, this is where Brussels enters into the European equation, because that's a location that really offends no one, to include it there. But having said that, I will say Versailles feels like a very European city. It feels like a very pan-European city. Yes, it's French culture, no question. It is in France, but to me, it feels like this very kind of pan-European city in spite of that history. So maybe we will see something like that at some point in the future.
The one thing, while the administration is in Brussels, they also have the EU Parliament meeting in Strasbourg,
True.
which is one of those cities which is in that magic region.
Alsace-Lorraine. Yeah.
That passes back, and every time somebody else gives it to somebody in the Hall of Mirrors, they wind up possessing Strasbourg.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And Strasbourg is also. So if you're going to pick a city to have a parliament in and spend some time in, Strasbourg would not be such a bad city. It's got this lovely mix of French, German, and kind of their own internal culture. So it's a really nice city. I like Strasbourg quite well.
And that kind of brings me back to the first period. I guess this is just kind of talking about my own historical journey.
Okay. Well, yeah. Tell us about the historical journey, Chris.
Because I'll be honest, I was a little disappointed. We are recording this mid-November,
right?
And as a little kid interested in history, I very much remember every single Veterans Day and Memorial Day. I had off school, and they had on The Dirty Dozen and Kelly's Heroes and all of those great movies about World War II, 20th century history, and it was such a disappointment that none of those were on again. I really had to stream some of them 2 days ago.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah, but because that's at least to me and to a lot of I would say a lot of Americans, World War I's a little bit further back. Franco-Prussia's not known about,
right?
But like Versailles and World War II is kind of in the milieu.
I
language
agree.
Is that from, by the way?
I agree, and I think that when I go back to thinking about sort of American emergence as a true global superpower, and how we interact with the world, I think that there is definitely some element of Versailles as being sort of that debut in a lot of ways. And even though things internally went completely awry with that, in terms of holdout Republicans in the Senate, and even some Democrats in the Senate that were working against Wilson, I still feel like Wilson himself, being present and wanting to have this lasting peace, really kind of cemented some of our American self-image.
Mhm.
about how we interact with defeated powers after wars.
The one thing that just shot through my mind is the United States had been involved in European wars before.
Right.
When you learn about American history, you learn about the French and Indian War,
Hmm.
and you learn about the War of 1812. I feel like World War One is the first time we're involved in a European war and use the same name for it.
We use the same name. Yeah, it's not the 7 Years' War. It's the French and Indian War, what we call it. Exactly. Right. Right. Well, and not only are we do we call it by the same name? The fields of conflict were not in North America.
Mhm,
They were the fields of conflict were in Europe,
mhm.
and it was American soldiers that were going en masse to Europe to fight this
Right,
war.
right.
And that that was strikingly different. Although again, this goes with our American self-image is we always have this idea that Americans show up and all of a sudden the war is won,
Mhm.
and that is definitely in World War One not an accurate interpretation. We were very much latecomers to the war. Not that we didn't contribute significantly, but we were very much latecomers to the war, and much of it had already been fought by the time we even got there.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but the other thing I was getting at was that first period
Hmm.
of the importance of Versailles is so completely lost because America generally doesn't. Yes, it's kind of being settled in the late 1600s, in the 17th century, but it is in no way important. It's in no way anything anybody's even thinking about. And so, you mentioned um the decorations on the ceiling
Hmm.
of the Hall of Mirrors as a fairly and I will admit perfectly I learned this in the research leading up to this episode.
Okay.
But what is that ceiling a decoration of?
I'll be honest, Chris. I can't remember what the decoration
Yeah,
is of.
and I've never been there. I saw pictures. It's that same Louis the 14th as a sun god, all these things, but it's actually telling the story of the Franco-Dutch War of
Okay. Yeah.
1672. That is the emergence of France as that superpower in Europe. Um, and if you look at if you read a description, the first thing it talks about is the Spanish allying with the Dutch, allying with the Germans in
And when we're talking
1672.
Germans, we're not talking exactly about Germans the way we're thinking of them, because we're talking Habsburgs, right?
We're talking Holy Roman Emperor. We're
Right.
talking Austrian Empire.
Right.
And that's the other thing that I want to that really struck me is the entire French state that Louis the 14th built upon and improved used Germany as a playground.
Hmm.
That is something that France really wanted to make happen, which is both northern Italy and Germany were going to be buffer states. Were
Hmm.
going to be small, weak little cities that didn't matter, didn't account for anything, so that we can see Austria coming, so that
Yeah.
we can see Sweden coming, so that
Hmm.
we have this barrier. And that's one of the important, that to me adds to the importance of that second event in the room.
Right.
It's because that's Germany is emerging from that state that France had put them in to some extent.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and it also it tells us a lot about sort of the French psyche as it relates to this, and in terms of how they viewed themselves, and how both victories and defeats sort of altered that self perception. and maybe a little bit about why the French opinion and the French idea of what the end of the war would look like was in many ways so different from what
Um,
the idea of the end of the war would look like to us or to the British.
by the way, I'm not trying to be pedantic here.
Uh-huh.
We just covered 150 years of European history. I'm pretty sure I know which one. Which war are you talking about?
Oh, I'm talking about World War One in this case. No, but you bring up a good point, because there's a lot of wars here, and all of those wars will look very different from the French side, as compared to the American side or the British side. They all do, but in this case, I'm specifically talking
Yeah.
about World War One.
Right.
That's a really good thing to point out, because you could literally plug that comment into a number of different wars and it would still be meaningful.
or Frank, again, you're just another thing you did here. You talked about the American or the British or the French side. There was another side in this war
Right.
that you didn't even mention. And by the way,
I didn't mention them, and I assume you're talking about the Russians.
I'm actually talking about the Germans.
You're
who were
talking about
told
the
to
Germans in this case. Okay.
who were told to show up and sign, but because
But they
keeping
weren't part of the negotiation, really.
right, but keeping it talking about this room of we're just going to dictate terms. That's
Mhm.
also what that other side is doing in the second instance of 1870.
Right.
They came
Right.
in and
And they said this is the way it's going to be,
Yeah.
and so sign it or else.
I think that's an interesting, the Americans and the British did not have a diplomatic tradition or the diplomatic experience of sign on the dotted line.
Right.
And to some extent, what I was talking about earlier, and to me, I'm trying to be very clear about because we are talking about huge swings of history. I'm going to try and make sure I preface what I'm talking about. But
Right.
30 Years' War, a little bit before Louis XIV, but really one of the beginnings of France using Germany as their playground. That ended in a negotiated peace where where all the sides were kind of exhausted and kind of decided this is what we're going to do. But, and like we said, all these other wars, even the Treaty of Vienna or the Congress of Vienna in 1850 that settled Napoleon, even there was a sense of Talleyrand was there. The French were represented there.
They were.
And they were part of that negotiation.
And there was a sense even that you, even though you didn't want a dominant France in there, you still wanted a France with some amount of power to be able to balance out the rest of Europe. The idea that you didn't want this huge power asymmetry. So there was still that sense that you needed, in some sense, to have a cohesive France.
Mm-hmm. And looking forward to the second instance in this room, the 1870 declaration of our existence as a country for Germany.
Right.
That's kind of what, now that I'm thinking about kind of a sweep of history here, I mean, the only European conflict basically between 1815 and 1870 was Crimea.
Right.
And even the settlement from the Crimean War was kind of a, you know what, we're all gonna be okay after this. We're all gonna go back to the way things were. And 1870, I think, might be the first time that you have a unconditional surrender, sign on the dotted line peace.
And a significant alteration in the power structure in Europe after that. Really significant. And I think that's one of the things that always strikes me is how much the progress from Prussia and the North German Confederation, again, as we've already talked about, is kind of a loose confederation. But once it is the German Empire, then you really have a continental I'm going to use the word superpower. It's not exactly the right word, but it's not the wrong word either.
Mhm.
I mean, so you clearly have a very strong Germany. It has technological strength. It has economic strength. It has demographic strength compared to countries like France. And so
Uh,
you really should change that power structure.
Something really strikes me about, and this is a nice segue to some other episodes that we may be talking about very,
Yeah,
very, very soon.
absolutely.
If you look at the native language of Nobel Prize laureates in chemistry and physics, in the
Uh-huh.
natural sciences, if you look at who's making these discoveries, once there is a Nobel Prize, right up until the First World War, Germany is a language. German is their language. If you are
Absolutely.
studying medicine or physics or chemistry, you learn German
You
because
had to.
that's where the new stuff is happening.
That's where the new stuff is happening, and that's where all of the best descriptions of diseases. And so again, everybody who's listened to the podcast knows that in my day job, I'm a physician, and I have a number of old German texts. My German is not good, but I have a bunch of old German texts. Why? Because they gave the most exquisite descriptions of what we would consider to be kind of classic presentations of clinical disease. And then it was really then kind of we'll call this the Anglosphere that really took predominance, and not until the first part of the 20th century.
When do you put that first part of the 20th century? It's I'm going to say the brain drain that happens in the 1930s. Would that be fair? Or
There's definitely a time period of transition there, but I do think that you could say from about 1890 to about 1930 there is a little bit of a transition, and then certainly after leading up to and after World War II, it's very prominent. And and this is something that Don and I talked about on the other podcast, about why that is. And one of the reasons why that is honestly the US federal government decided it makes sense for us to fund biomedical research, and so we're going to do that. And that has been, over the last 70 years or so, an extraordinarily successful model. And this is one of the reasons why there's so much innovation that's done in the US, because the funding's there.
that's a really interesting thought. Not hint, hint, wink, wink. Look back for future episodes.
Yeah.
Not just biomedical research.
That's right. And so again, I think about this in biomedical research because that's what I do for a living, through things like the National Institutes of Health, but the National Science Foundation, other private foundations that are in some ways supported by the government, or at least inspired by government funded science. It is no secret why. If you build it, they will come. And so we built that scientific infrastructure, and so people all over the world come here to research. Many of them stay. Many of them stay, and they have their entire careers here in the United States. This is a very good thing, that the people are able to do this.
So I want to come back to.
We'll come back. So
No,
this is and just for our audience, this is the one advantage of the long form of the room where it happened, as opposed to a fork in time, is that and Chris and I are both probably the most guilty of this, but we have time to go off on these little tangents, and so we'll just put a pin in that tangent. And we may come back and do an episode of a fork in time, and of a departure. What if no National Institutes of Health or something like that? That could be very interesting. So let's go back. We'll go back to the Hall of Mirrors.
And I want to come back to something you threw out.
Okay.
And again, like, knowing my academic background or historical whatever, it took a lot of self-control not to chase this. Talk about. We kind of were just talking about the sign on the dotted line nature of Versailles, and talk a little bit about what that caused for. And I was talking about Germany, but you threw another country out there, Russia. So
I did.
they didn't even have a spot to sign, did they?
They didn't. Well, and this is interesting, and we'll probably come back to this a little bit, talking about the relative punitive nature of all of these different separate pieces. And so Russia was excluded. They were not part of this negotiation because they'd already signed a treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and this was signed in 1918 between, at that point, the Bolsheviks and the Central Powers. And this was, in my opinion, this is a really punitive piece. Like, this was really rough on Russia. So basically, Russia, in the treaty, they signed over the Baltic states. They signed over several provinces in Western Russia. They recognized the independence of, Ukraine. There was even stipulations in there that led to creation of a Polish state, which hadn't existed there. There were financial reparations that existed as a part of this condition. This is a really punitive contract that they or treaty that they signed. So, and yeah, no seat at the table for any Russians.
The other thing I find, something just went through my mind, is you're right. The Bolsheviks, Lenin was in charge of a significant part of what we're going to call Russia. But let's just one more thing I want to talk about with this whole treaty metaphor. Not only
Russia was in chaos. It was in chaos at this point. So yeah, even though it was signed with the Bolshevik government, which again, this is what, March of 1918, Chris? Am I thinking about that right? And so this is very early in the Russian Revolution, and so there are still, there are still imperial Russian forces that exist. I mean, that is not gone yet, but it's,
and that's exactly what I was getting at. Is in 1919, when Versailles is signed, even if you had a spot for Russia to sign,
which Russia would you include?
who is going to sign for Russia?
Who was going to sign? Yeah,
because and I know you know about this. Yes, Soviet Union's very new. France, Britain, the United States, Italy, and Japan had troops in Russia.
That's true. That's
supporting another, I don't want to say another government, because there were several governments. There wasn't a single that they were supporting, but supporting Russian states claiming to be Russia.
Right. Which is very interesting because they're not included because they made a separate piece, but they made a separate piece with we'll call this a provisional government, or some sort of occupying force for part of the Russia that they didn't even recognize.
Russia. I'm gonna play a white Russian for a second.
Okay.
They didn't make a separate piece.
Yeah.
The Bolsheviks were German agitators.
Right.
Who, by the way, had been sent back to Russia with the support of Germany. And so Germany basically just made a deal with a bunch of rabble-rousers who they had created themselves.
Uh-huh.
So really, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk has absolutely no validity whatsoever.
No validity whatsoever, because these are not real Russians, and they betrayed our country to the Germans. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Yep.
The other really interesting thing, now that we're talking about it and we're down a rabbit hole and we don't have anyone to pull us back, and I'm okay with this. Let's put two things together that I think is really interesting.
Okay.
You mentioned March of 1918.
I did.
As when Brest-Litovsk is signed.
Right.
March of 1918 is also when Germany is finally able to take an entire front of troops. Everybody they've had fighting the Russians, and they throw them against the British and French and Commonwealth troops. And I mean the British, French, and Commonwealth troops, because what we were talking about earlier. Yeah, the United States is involved in this war,
Right.
but we're not there yet.
Well, and within 2 weeks of the signing of the treaty with the Bolsheviks, you had the 1918 German Spring Offensive on the Western Front.
Yes, and they have, in their minds, we have to do this because we have this very transitory advantage.
Mm-hmm.
We've got these extra troops.
Right.
We can use them now before the Americans get there, because in March of 1918, the United States hadn't really done much.
That's true. That's very true.
We didn't even have many troops in Europe at that point. And, that's getting back to kind of what we were talking about earlier. When the United States does get involved, they do play an important role, but a lot of stuff happened before them.
But really not by my recollection until the summer of 18 is when we really started having enough troops that were there in any significant numbers. And they were not immediately as effective. Our troops were their training was kind of rudimentary. We had no tradition at that point of sending our troops to fight wars across oceans, and so we weren't as effective. But yeah, certainly in March.
So one thing I find interesting, if you look at the American involvement in this early period, the American general was John Pershing, and he really fought against what the British wanted to do. What the British wanted to do was take individual American troops and put them as replacements in British units.
Mm-hmm.
And he really fought against that. He wanted an American sector. And one of the things that allowed the implementation of American forces was this March offensive. Because what happened in the March offensive is Haig, the British, I'm going to say the British Commonwealth commander, because he's also in charge of a lot of Australians and Canadians that are playing a really big role there. And Foch, the French commander, come together and decide, you know what, this is kind of crazy to think about. But up until they had been fighting the war for almost 4 years, and you had a British Commonwealth zone and you had a French zone, and never the two should meet. There wasn't an Eisenhower commanding everybody. And it was the reaction to this that we're going to have Foch as the overall commander. And Haig putting himself under a French commander was one of the things that made Pershing able to say, you know what, I will work under a single unified commander as well, because now we have just one instead of an American working for, well, why are we working for the British? Why are we working for this? No, there's one unified, and that's who we'll work under.
And I think that was really critical for the ultimate success, because I think one of the things, and kind of going back to the Spring Offensive and from the Germans, one of the things that Ludendorff counted on was the ability to kind of divide those British and French forces, and because Ludendorff knew that whatever was going to happen to happen pretty fast, because by the summer and fall of 1918 there was going to be a lot of Americans in Europe, and it was going to be a lot more difficult for them, and their temporary advantage from moving troops from the Eastern Front is not really going to matter very much after that.
But that did bring up something in the back of my mind that is always, and I'm going to discuss it and think about it, right?
Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned that in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they took, or I'm going to say the Germans took, they created an independent state. We all know what that means, in Ukraine.
Okay.
Ukraine is the breadbasket.
It
was the breadbasket of the Russian Empire. It has huge reserves of coal, which is extremely important. So,
and this is one of the reasons why I characterized that treaty as being even more punitive than what was eventually decided at Versailles, because it wasn't just money that they took. It wasn't small amounts, or we'll say relatively small amounts of territory from Germany. This is huge and very valuable Russian territory. This is, as you say, the breadbasket of Europe. Something like over half of their industrial capacity at the point, and Russia was not well industrialized at that point, but it took over half of that, took most of their coal. I mean, it really, the way that was settled was really crippling to Russia.
Yeah. I'm going to look at this from another perspective.
Okay.
It could have been really, really freaking good for Germany.
Yeah.
Because Germany is, I mean, in German, there's a term for the 1916-17 winter. They refer to that as the turnip winter because they had overmobilized. They had all of their men fighting all of their surrounding enemies. They didn't have people to work, to raise food. You just gained the breadbasket of Europe.
Right.
You're in a really, really dug in area. And these people you're worried about charging you don't actually know what they're doing yet.
Right.
So they're just going to stand up and walk at your machine guns.
Right.
So maybe if you're not, and this is one of the really interesting things when you read about Ludendorff, he's a hyper guy.
Yeah.
He has this like, oh, we have to do something. We have to run.
Maybe you really didn't though.
Think about this for a second though, because now that you've got this food source for the German homeland,
and energy source with all the coal. Yeah. Yep.
You're in a different position.
Right. And keeping in mind that we're looking at this from the future where we know of German defeat, but the Allies are not in great shape. France is pretty devastated. They lost over 1 million soldiers. They were economically devastated. The vast majority of the war on the Western Front was fought on French soil, which was also absolutely devastated. France was not in great shape.
You haven't used the word I was waiting for.
Okay, use it.
Mutinies.
Mutinies. Yeah, that's also true. Also true. There were mutinies. There were desertions. France was in bad shape. Britain was in better shape, but not good shape. Britain was in real risk of financial collapse because of all the costs of the war, even though there wasn't a lot of physical devastation.
Not even a risk. Britain financially collapsed because of the war. Nothing fixed that.
but I would argue that they didn't quite collapse. But the only reason is because we backstopped them.
Right.
And which is why there are is London a financial center of the world? Absolutely. But when you say what is the financial capital of the world, if you don't say New York, you're wrong.
people no longer say sound is a pound.
Yeah. That's true.
But yeah, that's something that and looking at, gee, it's good we're doing this in November because if you look at how Germany actually lost the war, they gambled. They got gambling. They sent out their fleet in November. They tried to send their fleet out. Hitler said absolutely not. Started a revolution in Kiel, and that led to the immediate collapse. It wasn't the Kaiser's people that signed that ceasefire. It wasn't the Kaiser that signed the ceasefire in the rail car, and it wasn't the Kaiser's government that signed the ceasefire in the Hall of Mirrors.
That's
if
true.
We're gonna try and bring it back to there.
Actually that's a great segue to bring it back to kind of what did those negotiations look like? And the negotiations, there was negotiations between the Allies to agree on a common negotiating position, and that happened a little earlier, but also happened in France, and so initially there were delegates from several countries, And so we've talked about France, Britain, and the United States, but there were two other countries that were at the table too. So you want to talk about those countries, Chris?
I know Italy. I know Italy was there.
And
Is that the
Japan.
other? Yes.
It was
Yes.
Japan that was there as well, which was really interesting.
See, and let me go ahead, plug future episode. Think about this. There was another country that wasn't a country yet, but tried to get represented there. Guy named Ho Chi Minh.
Oh,
anyway, we actually did that episode before.
That's true. We did.
The interesting thing that struck me about what you said, yes, the allied powers had negotiations previously about what were going to be our war aims. But here's the one thing I'm going to ask you, though. When these negotiations were going on, who were the allies?
Well, that's a really good question, because even though we see ourselves as Americans as being part of the Allies, we really were not. We were, I don't know, what did we, I think the term was like associated power.
We were the associated powers.
Yeah. And so when we're talking about allies, in my mind, we really are talking about the French and the British.
Mm-hmm.
And
the French and the British and the Italians and the Japanese.
True. But I also think about they were included, but I also think about the Italians as and I apologize for any Italian or Italian American listeners, but
you're really poking the bear.
I know. I'm sorry, Chris, but you know, the Italian contributions to this were very different than the French and the British contributions to the overall war effort. I'm
going to go ahead and quibble.
Okay.
By the way, my people were here. My people were here before then.
That's okay.
But what I would think is, comparatively, you're right. In absolute terms, you're absolutely right. But if you think about industrially, population-wise, what did Italy have in May 1915? Because that's when they got involved. What did they have to bring to the table?
Okay. As compared to in 1919, is that what you mean?
Well, as compared to Britain and France, they were not these powers.
No, that's true.
I've mentioned this, and I've made a point to, and this is a really interesting historical debate. Was I made a point when I talk about the British to make it very clear. Maybe we do need Alexis here, because when I talk about the British, I'm also talking about the Irish, who were part of the British Army, who were still part of Britain at this point. And I'm also talking about Australians and New Zealanders and Canadians. And when we talk about the French, we're talking about the Tonkinese and the Cochin China and the North Africans and the Senegalese. And these other powers have these massive reserves of people. I didn't even mention India. I have to mention India. They have these massive reserves of people, and they're feeling this stress. Italy's got Eritrea, kind of.
Not a real colonial power, not a big colonial power. You know, relatively less industrialized than these other countries, relatively less populous than these other companies or other countries. Still, you know, very much a European power. I mean, nobody would ever claim that Italy wasn't or isn't a European power, but at a different scale.
Yeah. And so I think, you know, when you think about like what happened at the British lose count of how many battles of Ypres, YPRES there were.
Right.
There were 4.
Yeah.
How many battles of Caporetto were there? 7 or 8?
I was going to say, I have no idea. It was a lot.
Twice as many as the Battle of Ypres.
But we don't hear about it.
We don't hear
about
it
nearly as much. Yeah.
But again, it's just a concept of they didn't have as much to give, but they definitely gave.
And they definitely gave.
Yeah.
Yeah. They definitely gave. And so they in part of the negotiations, they also received. They didn't receive everything they wanted to receive, but they got something.
The thing I find interesting is I look at this and I say, So the Allied powers, let's call them the 4 Allied powers, which we've thrown at this.
Okay.
The French and the British were the big ones,
Right.
and they brought along Italy
Yes.
and Japan. By the way, side tangent.
Mm-hmm.
In 1913, what side was Italy on?
They were originally part of the Central Powers, weren't they?
That was one of the great things Bismarck had done in his diplomatic world, was to bring the Italians on side. The
Right.
Italians were part of the Central Powers, but they
didn't stay there.
didn't stay because basically Britain and France made them a better offer.
Yeah.
But in these negotiations among these big 4, or these 4, the big 2 plus the other 2,
Yeah.
because that's going to play important here. When the United States gets involved, it throws a little bit of a monkey wrench into this. And what I'm just sitting here thinking about, it seems like the United States, Wilson comes in and says, you know what? We're going to have national self-determination. This
Mhm.
isn't a colonial war. We're not going to have these indemnities. And it seems like the 2 great powers, Britain and France, took everything they wanted and went to the United States and said, you're absolutely right. Let's throw Italy and Japan under the bus.
Yeah.
We're going to get ours.
We want to get ours. Yeah, that's exactly right. And
But you're right. We need to have an enlightened view about Shandong Peninsula and about Fiume and Trieste.
and there was some sense that the American aims were really either were naive, excessively idealistic, even disingenuous in some ways, because Wilson wanted to talk about peace without victory and the 14 points and things like this. But where the French and the British are saying, well, okay, some of this sounds fine to us, but we need our pound of flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we're not gonna go along with this.
And we got our pound of flesh. We're gonna sell out our allies.
Yeah, we'll sell out the rest of the allies as long as we get our pound of flesh. And that was kind of that was just the take of Clemenceau, who was the idea that, listen, you're across the Atlantic, United States, you're across the Atlantic, you're protected, and so you're not really at risk here, but we are.
Mm-hmm.
Even looking at it from the British side, when's the last time that the island was actually invaded? 1066. Even Napoleon couldn't do it.
By the French.
And so what's that? By the French.
The French.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so there's no you guys are protected and we're not, because they're going to come across Alsace-Lorraine again, and
everything. It all gets back to stuff that's happened in this room where they're
in this room. We've got to protect ourselves against this. And so,
yeah.
Well, which actually brings up, I'm going to make the next comment that actually is not quite a tangent. And this is why the French wanted not just their territorial integrity. They wanted their pre 1870 borders back. They wanted the Rhineland.
They wanted to redo what they had done during the 30 Years' War.
Right.
They wanted to break Germany up into a series of these North German. They wanted to roll back to before the second event we're talking about, the 1870. They wanted
buffer
Württemberg.
states.
They wanted Württemberg and Hanover, and they wanted to go back to the good old days of the 30-Year War, because Louis XIV might have known what he was doing there.
Yeah, he did.
Clemenceau would not have minded being the state.
No, Clemenceau would not have minded being the state. That's it. That's exactly right. The British were also, they wanted their pound too.
Yeah.
They wanted a pretty hard squeeze on Germany. Mm-hmm. I think, and in their case, it wasn't so much territory that they wanted; it was reparations and the inability of the German war machine to repeat that aggression.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The one thing I find it, you talked about Wilson a little bit as this idealist. The interesting thing is, and plug for another episode we did, he almost didn't make it to be president.
He didn't. Yeah.
And he really was there negotiating on his own.
Yeah.
as a very distinct tradition from from anything that had ever happened in the history of the United States.
Right. Well,
Um,
and without a lot of support from the other parts of the U.S. government.
Mhm.
And so this is one of the and I will say I am not a big Wilson fan. I don't know if you are, Chris, but I am not a big Wilson fan. I think he is probably one of our more overrated presidents.
Okay, this is the part where we have opinions, so I'm going to have an opinion.
Uh-huh.
Listen to A Fork in Time, and you're about to hear about who I consider as America's most ever overrated president.
Okay. Do you so for people who haven't heard the episode
Yes,
yet, do you want to tell them who you think the most overrated president is?
Kennedy.
Okay.
He's a hero because he almost blew up the world, and his successor actually accomplished everything that he gets credit for.
That's true. Yeah. So, well, I will agree that that Kennedy has has the air of mystique, and a lot of that really gives him more than he probably deserves. But I would say my opinion is Wilson is not so far behind as far as being overrated.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
you know and I think that I think you and Don I think actually talked about this on a Fork in Time about how Wilson shows up in these negotiations and is trying to lecture at people like the professor that he is,
Mhm.
instead of truly negotiating with them.
Yeah.
And
And by the way, I'm going to tie back to something else we talked about
right,
earlier here. If the Germans are a little bit more patient,
yeah,
and Wilson, because you talked about domestically, Wilson's out on a limb when
he's
it
way
comes
out
to
on a
what he
limb.
does out on
Yeah,
Versailles.
right.
Um, what happens domestically if the Germans sit back and America has a psalm? If you have Americans experiencing a Passchendaele.
Interesting. So if they're just a little more patient, yeah, that's an interesting thought. What are you thinking with that, Chris?
I mean, because again, Wilson, he was not, he didn't really come in 1912 with a whole lot of legitimacy
Right,
because Teddy Roosevelt had split the Republicans.
right.
Then he got a little bit lucky that a war broke out
Uh-huh.
and he kept us out. He's Mr.
Stable
America
hand. America will
stays
stay
out of
peace in our
Europe.
time. Yeah.
Peace. He kept us out of war.
Mm-hmm.
People marked their ballots in 1916 for Wilson, saying he kept us out of war.
Right.
And then, again, back then, the United States president wasn't inaugurated until March.
Right.
So March 1917, a
Right.
year before all this other stuff we talked about. Within 3 weeks, he asked us to declare war.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, now it would be 1919 when you really have American casualties matching what we saw in Britain and France in 1915.
Right.
Gee, he's already out on a limb. He's already has some significant opposition. And then you do a 180 on the promise you made to get elected. And we start having, remember, both Britain and France, 2 years into the war, changed governments.
That's true. They did. And this is the is it the I'm trying to remember the name of is it the coupon election of 1918? Am I thinking about that correctly?
Which Great Britain?
Great Britain in 1918.
Yeah. Well, because remember, in 1916, they basically created a national unity government.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't an election, but Lloyd George comes into office there, and there's a cabinet reshuffle. Basically, because of the Psalm and what's happening over there, we want different ideas and different leadership. And Clemenceau was not the French leader that led them into World War I.
True. Very true.
So then 1920 is an election year.
Well, right.
And what kind of a bath are the Democrats going to take in the 1918 midterms?
That's exactly right. And by 1918, the Republicans had taken over the Senate again. And one of the things we haven't talked about is Wilson is in no condition to do anything by this point. So it was in 1919, he had a huge stroke.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was paralyzed. He was bedbound. This is really, I mean, for whatever it's worth, we could argue that for a time the president of the United States was Edith Wilson, his wife.
Yes.
And that it took him quite some time to even recover sort of his cognitive faculties, and he never recovered fully from this. And so this would be a situation that would be completely intolerable by modern standards, to have a president that was so affected. They clearly would have been the 25th Amendment would have applied.
I mean, well, there wasn't a 25th Amendment yet.
There wasn't then. There is now. That's what I'm saying.
I'm reminded of we were just talking about Douglas Haig, but I'm reminded of Alexander Haig in the United States.
Oh, after Reagan was shot. Don't worry, I'm in charge here. No.
And that was that was a matter of hours after the president had suffered a medical incident.
Well, right, yeah, absolutely, and when you had a ready acting president in George Bush that was right there, but yet Haig decides to say, "I'm in charge here." That kind of sounds like it too.
But it's also, let's think about like media and information flowing. That's a real change. That you can't not know who the president is and where they are for a matter of hours, versus at this point he's gone for like months.
Right. Well, and that was 1981 too. I mean, imagine, that's 40 years ago.
Yeah.
It feels like it's minutes at this point.
It would be minutes at this. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do also want to caution us right now. We've turned this episode into a fork in time.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah. we've gone back to that. What if Germany waits? Yeah, gee. Okay.
What if Germany waits? But let's bring us back a little bit, if you would, Chris. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about what the French aims and the British aims were, and so what really were the American aims? What was Wilson trying to do, and how did that sort of fall short?
He wanted to turn Europe into a hippie drum circle where they all sat around, sang Kumbaya, and got along with each other.
And how'd that work out for him?
It did not. and the reason it did not, if I can just go ahead and say this, is because he went in there thinking that was in the realm of possibility. Like all of this stuff we're talking about that happens because of this room is why that doesn't work. Germany had this experience. I mean, nobody wants to be another country's playground.
Right.
Nobody, the 30 Years' War, that scar on German psyche of like, my God, the Swedish invaded them. The Swedish. They can't put together a decent dresser, and they invaded Germany. Apologies to our Swedish listeners, but and anybody who's ever bought something from IKEA, you're cheering me right now, and I know this. But like so many of the things that happened in that room and this history, for a professor, Wilson did not know his history.
He didn't know his history, and I will also say, for a professor, one of the most important skills as a professor is to be a good communicator, and he was an exceptionally poor communicator of this, which is really striking. Naivete, sure, but just an exceptionally poor communicator of what came to be known as his 14 points.
Mm-hmm. Mhm. I, I, I don't. Other feelings aside about the man, we already touched a little bit on Reagan. If you gave Reagan the 14 points and sent him to Versailles, the great communicator, I don't think you come out with a different result. You
That
have
is
these forces there.
probably true. That is probably true. So I think that there is some truth to the fact that this was just never going to work. You know, the framework was never going to work, but it was also further impaired by two things. Well, several things, but two that are kind of top of mind. One is that he came in with a very heavy-handed method and did not communicate it well. And then number two is there was no support at home, or well, little support at home. And this was a treaty that would have to be ratified by the Senate, which was in Republican hands.
Mhm.
And so that was going to be a non-starter for him.
Actually, from everything I've heard, I do feel like that may actually be a point where being a great communicator might have helped. Because when he did go to the Senate, I feel like the Senate is a place where he could have won. He could have swung people. He couldn't
Maybe a
swing
better
Clemenceau.
communicator. So well,
Yeah.
so let's go back to the Reagan example.
Yeah.
So Wilson did not have good success with a Republican Senate. And as part of the kind of aftermath of his efforts to try to sway those minds, he had a stroke. You know, that was one of the stressors that very probably led to him having a stroke. Let's say this is not Wilson in a Republican Senate. Let's say this is Reagan and a Democratic Senate. Would Reagan have a better time? Would there be a higher probability that they would go along with something like this than in I think the answer is yes, there's a higher probability. Is it a given? No.
It's not a given, but the very image of Woodrow Wilson sitting down and having a beer with the president pro tem of the Republican Senate, or any of those people opposing him, is not laughable. We know about the relationship between Tip O'Neill and Reagan.
and I from what I gather, it was an orange blossom that is the drink of Reagan's choice.
Okay.
That's my recollection. Not my favorite drink, but evidently Reagan liked it.
Yeah. So I do think that's somewhere that a communicator could have changed the abject failure we think of Versailles as, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the possibility exists. And at the very least, the impression of a more just peace that would have proceeded from the 14 points. And I would encourage anybody who's listening, go look at the 14 points. Go look at them, because it's actually a very interesting look at this. And looking through modern eyes, a lot of this may seem very obvious, but they weren't so obvious at that point, where things like territorial concessions and colonization and puppetization was really routine as an aftermath of wars.
All the things that happen in this room, every single time,
all the things that happen.
And it feels, a really interesting thought just went through my mind, kind of a way of feeling about this is the reason it doesn't look so extreme to us today is because of what happened to that rail car by the person who destroyed that rail car. Because up until then, Europe had been having these growing states, more populous states, the sign on the dotted line, these Carthaginian pieces. And it feels like that Europe went the way of the rail car in 1945.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Well, and this could be a follow-up episode, is how does this lead? How does the piece of quote unquote peace in 1919 lead to World War II and a very different peace in 1945, which led to the Cold War and the necessity for greater Western European cohesion. And you had mentioned something, I think this might have been even before we were on recording, Chris, the European coal and steel community, which we now know by a very different name.
No, this
So
was on podcast because it was I think I was wondering aloud why the European Union never uses the Hall of Mirrors.
oh,
Because
that's right. Yeah, that's right, Chris. Yeah, you're exactly right. But it kind of comes down. So that's even better. We come
yeah,
full circle in this, and how a lot of this very, very clearly led to the structure where we are today.
yeah, yeah. Or another interesting point about it, other than their involvement in the 1919 example, Britain did not have much to do with the other mass events that happened in this room.
True.
And now
That's
they
very
no
true.
longer have anything to do with or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely a whatever. For sorry for our British listeners.
Well, no. Let's set it up at a future point. We can do one
we
devoted to just the British relationship with this room.
yeah, that is actually that would be a really interesting episode too. So very good.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, I think we're kind of coming up on a good stopping point here. Is anything else that you wanted to say about the Hall of Mirrors?
Not really. I mean, I'd love the chance to see it myself, but no. Again, I think part of me, gee, I think at some point we can probably, audio clip this episode and turn it into a Fork in Time
We
episode
probably could. Yeah.
about the Germans waiting, because we did have a nice diversion there.
Yeah.
We have covered a lot of stuff. We've covered, an American Passchendaele. I do kind of want to keep track of how many other A Fork in Time episodes I feel like I make an explicit reference to when we
I
do one
feel
of
like
these.
we came up
'cause
with
there
3 or
were
4 really good ideas
at
even
l-
to talking today.
Oh, I'm talking about references back to previous A
Oh,
Fork in
previous working
Times.
times. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Kaiser Wilhelm, the Ho Chi Minh episode, all of those. But I think now, having listened to us go on like this, you get why this was a natural choice. It just seems it's so weird. In any of these events, any of the one things that we're talking about here probably would make this a pretty significant room.
Absolutely.
But the fact that all three of them happened in the same one is a really interesting exploration of the concept that we wanted to try with this podcast.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree.
All right.
Well, very good. Well, thank
Yeah.
you, Chris. It was a pleasure to join you this morning. I always enjoy our conversations.
Yeah, you too. I was really happy that you and I were able to get together for this. So yeah, we normally tease the next episode. I believe just because of some, the holidays and everything, you may already know what the next episode might be. We were talking about a Dallas episode,
We were talking
but
about a Dallas episode.
so maybe by now we have teased that up on 2 different episodes to be the huge, amazing, super episode. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I want to thank everybody for giving us your time listening today, and have a great time, everyone.
Thank you.
Once again, wanted to express my thanks to Chris and to Eric for their fine work there on today's episode, room number 4, about the Hall of Mirrors. As they alluded to, our room number 5 is going to be a particular hospital trauma room in Dallas, Texas. You might be able to guess what that topic will be around, and we hope that you join us next time for that. Between now and then, we'll probably release a little bit of a teaser or trailer here on the channel that'll introduce some of the things ahead of that and let you know where to go and find us on the website and provide us feedback. So we certainly welcome you to give us feedback on today's episode. You can still find us at the main website. That's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. The A and the podcast are both important to get to the right place. And look there for the links that will take you to the Room Where It Happened pages on that website. But you'll also find information there about our parent, mother, the original podcast, A Fork in Time, where we focus on alternate history. So once again, thanks for joining us today. My special thanks again for Chris and Eric for being who they are as a valuable part of the team. Again, I repeat, the team that brings you the Room Where It Happened, and I hope you enjoyed their work today. Look forward to next time. Thanks.